Okay, folks, take a look at this diagram, this outline of the way that we look at the world. Now you'll see that there's an arrow that's going out from your eye, and it's looking at the world, and it's picking up the world that way. And there's this little thing in the middle, it's like a dirty filter, it's called biases, but that's okay because you work hard to keep yourself not biased, and so you can see really well through there. You just have to kind of try, right? And that is the way we look at our lives, right? Go on, shake your heads. I know it's true. I do this, okay? But it's a terrible way of looking at life. It's super dangerous. It causes all kinds of problems. And we're going to go into why that is. We're going to go into the fundamental origins of biases. We're going to talk about the two gateway biases that really kill things for us and let in all these other ones. Then we're going to talk about 4 working biases that have to do with politics in general. And if you understand these 4 working biases, you probably got something on the order of 80–90% of what's going on in political biases. There are probably 30 involved, but these 4 get you really started well. And then at the end, we'll talk about the sort of $9.99 miracle cure that we have for biases today. I mean, it is amazing what we can do to beat our own biases and also to help other people with their biases. But let's get started with a little evolutionary psychology. There's actually evolutionary psychologists now. And they're very clear on the fact that all of our biases really originated in our hunter-gatherer period. Now, hunter-gatherer is a super long period. Technically, it's really millions of years. It goes all the way back to the chimpanzee phase. And after hunter-gatherer was this tiny little sliver of time where we spent about 10,000 years in agriculture. And then we did whatever modern man does that isn't exactly agriculture, but we think is totally normal. It's not from an evolutionary standpoint at all. So in reality, our minds were actually evolving through this long period of time that was 99% of history, and only 1% of the time have we really had a conscious mind that's actually involved in doing things. So who's the junior partner? Okay, did the conscious mind just suddenly pop up and go, that's it, thank you very much, I got this, right? Because that's what that looks like, the little, you know, oh, I see everything, it's a little uncomfortable, the biases, that's all right, I got this, you know. The non-conscious mind is really safety-driven, and that colors everything that it does. And if you think about it, these murderous little lives, I mean, even 50,000 years ago, we murdered ourselves at a 15% rate. That's what we were dead by 29 on average during that time. So, I mean, that's a lot of murdering. And it was presumably a lot worse before that. So very safety-driven lives, and we survived through a very, very dangerous time as a society somehow with the non-conscious mind in charge like that. But what happens now, because the conscious mind is actually a junior partner, is that everything that's important that we think of, everything that is important that we do, bubbles up input from the non-conscious mind to begin a conscious process. And that's how life happens. It's like a president of a country, all right? There are people who, you know, report to him, and then people that report to him, and people that report to him. There's all these senses, you know, down to actual senses, you know, we smell and things like that. And that all comes up and bubbles through a non-conscious experience. And then the president sits in the Oval Office with all this input, not from the real world, but from all this non-conscious stuff. And makes plans and thinks he's doing it all himself, right? That's the way it kind of works in real life. Now this viewpoint, this simplistic viewpoint that we have here of just looking through this little filter that we can really get around is called naive realism. And it's the most common philosophy of the mind that mankind has. It's called naive because it's freaking stupid, okay? And it's called realism because we think of ourselves as this sort of 26 megapixel camera, you know, that just sort of wanders around through life, and I got this, you know, I see it. Wait. Oh yeah, I got my audio on. You know, we're covering it. there. I was there. I made a movie. It's in my head. I know what happened. Let me tell you about it, you know. That's the way that we think. Well, you still believe this. I think you do. I mean, I know I do at a certain level. I really believe that. And it's hard for us to accept that life is actually really bizarre in there. That we have, you know, I mean, we have an 800-page book about visuals, for instance. The non-conscious mind deals with all the visuals. There's 20 modules going bing, bang, bong in there while we look at anything. Incredibly complicated life that the non-conscious mind has built over millions of years, literally. So we're coming in really, really late in the game, and that's really important. Now, the first thing that naive realism lets in, because that's what's going on, we're letting ourselves get infected with this dumb idea of how it works. The first one is called the objectivity assumption. Now, that's one of the best names of biases because it's actually clear. Some of these names are a nightmare. But this one's clear. We are assuming we're objective all the time, right? I mean, I do. You do. I know you do. It's just something that we do. We wander through life and we don't question our inputs. Just don't do it. Why should we? We were there. We got the camera. You know, I can tell you. Okay, you remember when we had DNA evidence that finally got to come forth in courts of law, and we had hundreds of cases that were thrown out with eyewitnesses from murders, from assaults, from rapes, things that you might be able to figure out, you would think. And then legal experts said that there were thousands of cases that would have been thrown out if we kept DNA evidence, right? In the year 2000, George W. Bush was elected by the Supreme Court, and 94% of conservatives believed that it was the appropriate things for the Supreme Court to do. 84% of Democrats knew that it was absolutely inappropriate. Okay, whenever you get that kind of, people are looking at the same thing with their camera, you know, and they have that big a difference, that's the objectivity assumption letting in goofiness, okay? Maybe there's other biases that came in, but having objectivity assumption like that lets biases, it's like having a wind behind you because you're open to biases. You're squinting through that filter and going, yeah, I still got this. Don't worry about it, you know. That's the objectivity assumption. Now the second gateway bias, I'm going to call the fundamental error. The technical name of it is the fundamental attribution error or the correspondence bias. It's not really a bias. It's actually it's a technique, but we're going to call it a bias because it's useful to think of it in those terms. Scientists make that division. It's not necessarily helpful. The fundamental attribution error is because we attribute to people's character or their personality problems when it actually could have very well been circumstances, the situation in some sense. Now, this is something actually, oddly enough, happens much worse in America than in some cultures. And you can think, for instance, you got a red light running, you know, your red light's going, you start going, and all of a sudden this car goes, and just kind of goes right through in front of you. And I know if it happens to me, I'm just, what a freaking numbskull, right? And you're sure that this guy's an idiot or just really rude or drug-addled or something, but it could be somebody that just needs to get to the hospital, right? And it turns out that in Japan, that's what they think. When you interview them, you say, you know, what happened? The guy's saying, I don't know, he probably had to go to the hospital. In America, they go, he's a freaking idiot. He's a drug-dealing, you know. And so it turns out that we have this error a lot ourselves. We just somehow culturally inherited this error. Let me tell you about why this is so bad. Okay, this is a really important error. It's the founding of social psychology, actually, and it's amazing that we don't teach this. This is the only thing of this whole Reach the Right thing that needs to be taught in public school, actually well before 8th grade, in my opinion. Okay, we mislead each other all the time. We get offended, overly offended, because of the fundamental error. We have, at the social level, we discriminate because of the fundamental error. We blame the victim all the time, you know, and the famous one is that we blame women for rapes. But we do this all the time. We're walking down the street where we see somebody that's homeless and we just, something in us just knows that this person is not up to par in some way, otherwise why would they be there? It's real simple. We attach the circumstance and say, oh, well, it's because of that person. We even do it in good ways, okay? We'll have a friend and he gets a promotion at work, but we love the guy and he's like obviously really worth it, Well, maybe he is, maybe he isn't, But in America, we tend to really attribute a lot to the human being that way. The 1994 Rwandan massacre between the Hutus and the Tutsis is a case study in the fundamental error. And it's also a case study in getting over the fundamental error later. Now, the good news about this is that there's ways to tell about the fundamental error in ourselves, okay? And the key one is that you're not listening when somebody talks. That's the best way to understand. Your mind wanders. You're trying to figure out what you're going to do that weekend while they're talking, like saying during a political conversation. Why would you listen to them? You disagree with them and there's something wrong with them and, there's other things to do. You interrupt them. You have something more valuable to say. It's another form of not listening, right? Or you have these thoughts as they're talking. Stupid? Yeah, stupid. Evil? Probably. Crazy? Wow. But also, personality things. Wow, he seems shallow. He's very shallow, And there's no way a lot of times in these conversations to really get true good senses of that. In fact, you can pretty much bet that if you're having those kinds of feelings a lot when you're having political conversations, guess what? You're kind of talking to yourself. It's a fundamental error that you're undergoing here. Because you're allocating to their personality, their character, things that aren't part of their personality or their character. Okay? Now, is there miracle cures to this? I wouldn't say that there's miracle cures to it, but again, you keep track of those things and you try to give a little bit of a pause. And we'll talk about some actual techniques that we can use toward the end with the fundamental error. So those are the two gateway biases. They're the most important ones. They're kind of hard to see sometimes, but the good news is, I guess it's kind of good news, is that you can see the working biases that they let in the door. And those, we're going to go with the acronym ATACO. We're going to cover 4 of them. The first one, the T, is the transparency assumption. And that's us assuming that because we see something, other people can see it as well. Let me just give you a couple of good examples of it. If you hear anybody with half a brain can whatever it is, that's the transparency assumption. Okay. Another good example of the transparency assumption is when little groups get together and they talk amongst each other in a sort of super fast code. They use the same ideas and the same jargon, and they get themselves convinced, and all of a sudden really strange ideas start flying out in all directions. When I was a kid, the city that I lived in had 5 city councilmen, and 3 of them were really, really hard right and just kind of reactionary. I don't even know if it's fair to call them conservative. And they voted that anybody that went downtown had to wear a firearm, because they just got to talking and it just made sense. And off they went, with this crazy idea. And you see this with strikes. When a union will strike, maybe for good reasons, maybe for bad, it's not really the point. But then once the strike gets going, now we have these 2 groups that are sitting there and just talking to each other. And it's just transparent that the other guys are stupid, evil, and crazy, all at once. And so you just got to sit there and ignore them. And you'll see these groups sit and ignore each other with millions of dollars on the line because it's become this giant moral issue and it's so obvious. So that's the way the transparency assumption can work. The second one, though, that's not a bad one related to as far as these things go. It's probably the easiest of all these. The second one is probably the most common, and it's called anchoring. Now, it's actually called technically anchoring and adjustment, but anchoring is about the notion of just kind of sticking with an idea when you first hear it, or a particularly vivid idea, and then later on, when facts come along that prove that idea wrong, you just ignore them. It's not a problem, right? Super common. Really, really, it's something that we do a lot, and it has to do with, we talk a little bit in the neurology section about the left hemisphere is just kind of likes to grab things and run with it. And this is a good example of that happening. So anchoring is really dangerous in a lot of ways. It should be. But a lot of people don't understand how very basic it is to us. And I don't want to be too unfair about anchoring. It is a technique, so it's not technically a bias. And recent studies, the last 3 or 4 years, have shown that actually anchoring really, really works really well for a specific kind of problem. Okay, you're a metrosexual in San Francisco, right? And you're waiting for a phone call, and your friend calls, and you get it, and it's Brian, and you're like, yeah, dude. And he says, dude, there's Dello shots down at Lulu's. And you're like, I'm there. And you hang up and you're gone, right? So what happened? Well, you got simple input, and it was a simple problem. You had to get Jello shots that night. You had to hang out with your friends, and off you went, right? Anchoring is great for that, it turns out. It turns out it's a really good technique, but it's a nightmare if you're doing anything really involved, okay? And we do it anyway. It doesn't matter how involved it is, we still anchor all the time. So we'll see somebody on TV, and we'll go, wow, he has such good hair. I'm going to vote for him. Or, something I might do is, oh, his wife looks so happy. He's probably a good guy, just dumb stuff like that, right? But it's simple, and I can grab it at the beginning, and there's nothing to prove it wrong, so I just stick with it. And then later, when Hairstyle Boy gets elected, I don't even remember why I voted for it. One of the ways that anchoring can really happen a lot is at first meetings. And so anchoring is one of the biases that we'll go through that is a beginning kind of a bias. So with conservatives especially. Now, you might be talking to a conservative, say, and having an argument about something. Maybe you talk for an hour and a half, you're getting tired. Some other conservative will walk in that you agree with, will whisper in his ear. 5 seconds later, the guy's like, yeah, I guess I agree with you, right? I've actually had something similar to that happen several times on the road. What's going on there? I mean, why does one guy have a sacred key into the guy's brain and the other guy is just like, I can't make it fit in the hole. Why is that? That's the outgroup bias. I'm in the outgroup. I was born an idiot. I was born wrong, or if I wasn't born, I veered off somewhere, and I became stupid, evil, crazy somehow. And I'm not worth listening to. In fact, you kind of need to make sure that you do the exact opposite of whatever this monkey is saying. That's what the outgroup bias is. Now, the in-group bias is kind of hidden in there, right? That was him, this guy who just, he agrees with him ideologically, so it's okay. He can just whisper and change his mind. He's got a magic key into his brain. It's the opposite. Biases work a lot this way. We don't think of it, but there's a positive element to biases and a negative element. Now, the origins of the outgroup bias are really interesting because, you kind of think, well, this is a terrible, mean thing to do. But remember the hunter-gatherer existence. Remember that 99 out of 100 times that, some guy could come trotting over the hill and give you a taro root, and you could trade with him to give him some gold or something or whatever. They probably didn't do gold, but whatever it was they did. And, off they would go. And then the 100th time, the guy would come over here with a taro root, and then there'd be an army behind him, and he would wipe you out. It was a brutal, brutal existence, and tribes needed to totally distrust one another in order to survive. It wasn't a game. It was mean wins. And you can see that. That's how we got here today. That's why we have the outgroup bias, because the mean guys won, okay? And the guys that were nice, that said, oh, come on in, peace, love, happiness, working together, they're all dead. We didn't get their genes. So that's how the outgroup bias got here. It was healthy and it was appropriate. Is it healthy and appropriate now? I don't know. I talk to some conservatives sometimes and they say, yes, it is. guys are evil, you know. But no, it's not as appropriate now as it was in our past. And so we need to just remember that and try and do what we can to sort of soften that effect in our own lives to the extent that we can. Okay. So now the final bias that I want to talk about is super common. And it's called the confirmation bias. And what that means is that you take every little thing that you hear and you love and pet your worldview with it. You just love this. And even if it's like, if it's totally against your worldview, he's such an idiot. That's what we do with the confirmation bias. Now again, it's kind of healthy, right? You go to a rally and political rally, and there's a guy up on the stage, and he says, you know, are we going to let him do that? And you're like, no, right? And there's all this confirmation bias going in. People are telling you, your worldview is so cool, right? It's not exactly a bias in that case. That's just a way of getting up and pumped and getting down the road. In other words, you're sort of planning and using the bias in a somewhat healthy way, arguably. Lots of times we find that conservatives have a character flaw. We'll use it the same way that I was describing. It's just kind of like, yep, see? Obviously evil or obviously stupid.
That's what this fight is about in this part of the world, planting the seeds of democracy.
That seed of democracy in Iraq.
It was about what happens when one country loves another country very much. And that country then deposits his democracy seed.
And he says he does this with liberals and conservatives, but it's mostly conservatives. You know, he's making one of those faces like, you know, or whatever it is that he's doing, right? And you're laughing because of the confirmation bias. That's exactly what's going on, because you know that your worldview is so superior to this idiot's, and it just makes you feel so good. If you argue about politics all the time, if you get up in the morning and like, yeah, you're a confirmation bias guy, definitely. So that's the 4 that I wanted to cover today, and that's enough to start with. The first thing to do to try to focus on how to get past them is to really think about the gateway biases. And to think about what is it that you can actually do to get past the objectivity assumption, assuming that you're objective all the time, and secondly, getting past the fundamental error, which is blaming problems on people instead of a broader range of situation, circumstance types of information. And the first step that we've already done it, actually, research shows that this conversation is enormously powerful because all of a sudden you're actually aware of something, and so you become familiar with the signals a little bit when these things bubble up from the non-conscious mind, and you can ask questions. It's like, wow, I am thinking negatively about this guy, you know, or, oh yeah, I just watched 3 Jon Stewarts in a row, right, you know. So that's a really useful thing. But after that one little step, things get a little tricksy. It's kind of, you have to be kind of careful and think about what to do. But the first trick is taking time. And what I mean by that is taking time to make a decision. Taking time when your decision that you made before might look a little bit funny, taking time to relook at it, okay? It may be taking time because you're having this emotional rush because of this guy that's saying something, you know, and just taking the time to let that emotion pass through you. Maybe you have to, you know, go out and, excuse me, I got to go call the wife or something. You take time to get past emotion so that you can get some clarity. So there's one other trick, and that has to do with my point about biases working both ways, and that's the in-group bias. Okay, now we talked about how you might be able to get into the in-group by, you know, by behaving well, taking good care at the beginnings, because they might actually let you into the in-group. But the other thing is that you have to let them into your in-group. And how do you do that? That's tough to do. And the answer is that you have to get to know them somehow. So you ideally know something about their personality, but even more importantly, typically, find out something about their background, something about their situation. It makes a big difference. And then you don't try to have any kind of sensitive political conversation or any kind of sensitive conversation at all with them until you've had one strong, positive emotion about them personally. Now, if you're shallow enough, that could be, wow, this guy's really well dressed. But that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking more about, wow, this guy's a really good dad. Or, wow, she seems like she works so hard, right? It seems like a little thing, but those little keys provide an ability to let them in your in-group and get them out of the out-group so that when they say something, instead of it being from somebody who's stupid, evil, crazy, now you're giving them the benefit of the doubt. They're more like being able to come in with a key and actually convince you of things. Not necessarily, but you're getting out of the negative bias and maybe being able to get a little bit of the positive bias to happen. Trust me, this is a real key to a lot of really great conversations that are sensitive and important with teenagers, with lovers, with people at work that you have to deal with, okay? Never have a voluntary, sensitive conversation with anyone about anything until you've had a positive emotional experience somehow with them. Is that vague? It's not vague. You can sit there and you know, yeah, I'm starting to feel good about this person. Hopefully it's, wow, this guy's so cool, you know? But that's not that common. Sometimes it does happen. But it's enough to have something positive, some positive respect factor happen. If you have to wait, wait. If you have to noodle and talk about barbecuing and the dog, wait. Talk about noodling. Talk about barbecuing and the dog. Just do it. It's worth it. So, taco, the transparency assumption, anchoring, the confirmation bias, the outgroup bias, those are the working biases. The gateway biases that sit on top of those, the objectivity assumption and this horrible fundamental error of ours, all that is benefited or actually enabled by being naive realists. Now, I didn't want to show you the image of what actually is happening cognitively because it's scary and useless, but it's 1,000 times as complicated as that simple drawing that we looked at the beginning. And if you can keep that in mind, that this is a really complex process and that we make a lot of mistakes at it, you can enter into this whole situation with humility and begin to take the time that you need to make good decisions and adjust them, and also to work to get people into your in-group instead of keeping people in the out-group. Okay, let's take some questions. Go ahead.
So you talked about the gateway biases and then the 4 others. Mm-hmm. Is that it, or are there more that we should be aware of?
No, I'm sorry. As I mentioned, there's actually about 30. There's a couple of other ones that are important. Besides the 4, there's the in-group bias. It's related to the out-group bias. Very important. Another one that is related to anchoring is the authority bias, which actually conservatives have a lot more than liberals because conservatives tend to be more authoritarian, or that's not a nice word. I don't even like that word. I'm sorry I said it. They tend to have more respect for authority and hierarchy. So, these are people that a lot of times listen to Rush Limbaugh. And, you have a combination of anchoring, because it's Rush said it and boom, it's in there and you can't get it out. And the authority bias. He's an authority, so you just kind of go with it and you don't do a lot of research. So that's another one. As I mentioned, there's many others and we can't go into them all, but there's a lot of different ones. And, a great thing to do is to just go to Wikipedia. It's very humbling. Go to Wikipedia and go down the list. They've got about 50 or 60 of the 100 or so there. You can just read it in about 3 minutes. Super fast and very, very humbling. So, anybody else?
Can I ask a second question?
Yeah, sure.
When you talk about the confirmation bias, it makes me think a little bit about self-fulfilling prophecy and circular reasoning. Is that an accurate analogy, or do you see those as different?
I think so. I mean, I do. I think there's a couple of things involved with circular reasoning, but I think a lot of the reason why we do circular reasoning from a motivational standpoint is because we love our worldview, and we want it to succeed, yay team. Yeah, I think so. Thanks for that.
Yeah, so it seems to me that these biases, if they've evolved through evolution, must have evolved to serve some positive function. So
Yes.
there must be something good about them.
Yes, there is. Thank you for that. Evolutionary anthropologists and psychologists call the biases error management techniques. And the idea, if you think back to the lecture about the outgroup bias, right? I mean, clearly, it was important to 100 out of 100 times murder people that came into your tribe. I mean, it just was. And if you didn't do it, you were killed. Almost all these biases that I just talked about, they all have origins that evolutionary psychologists have been able to kind of rationalize out based on just sort of guessing about the circumstance of human beings. And one of the things that we have to realize is that they're called error management techniques because they're not perfect, right? And evolution didn't make us perfect, but it made us alive. It kept us alive somehow. So it was superior to the errors that we had that we were making before, like letting visitors in, So that's, I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah, they're error management techniques. Yes.
I think that the ideas that you're sharing with us, that your hope is that they'll be useful for progressives or for liberals. But it seems to me they would be completely equally useful for conservatives.
Yes, they are. They are. Absolutely. And it depends on the idea. Sometimes, to say that is a really broad statement. I mean, actually, Reach the Right, as I mentioned, is designed for a large portion of what I'm doing is to get good liberal policies in place, good liberal candidates elected. But, aside from that, this bias lecture has nothing to do with liberals and conservatives, really. In fact, if anything, I'm trying to speak for conservatives in a way here in the bias lecture, just saying, hey, you guys are causing a lot of problems by distorting your own view and making it really difficult to have good conversations. So, thank you. Good point. Anything else?
Scott,
yes.
Pointers on how to get into the conservatives in-group before you begin a heated discussion.
Well, thank you for that question. That's a really good question. And we deal with this a little bit in the psychology talk, but just really briefly, the idea is that they are really, really polite. And that's an unknown thing on our side, but actually studies have shown that conservatives are significantly more polite than we are. And we tend to underestimate that. And what happens with conservatives, again, that liberals don't understand, is that we often start in the in-group because they're so polite. And we work often really hard to try and start in the out-group. And if we don't start there, we work really hard to get there quickly as liberals. And so one way to work on it is to, one thing that I do consciously is that I spend time at the beginning of all my sensitive conversations trying to identify with the other individual. In the case of politics, I want to identify them with at least 2, probably 3 different things that I agree with them about, I happen to be concerned a lot about fiscal prudency, for instance. It's real easy for me to talk with conservatives about making sure that we, have a responsible government fiscally, for instance, And you do that just a little bit, a couple of minutes, you're kind of in a lot of times. And you can come in later and kind of go, yeah, I'm actually kind of a Marxist. And they'll listen, because they respect you by then, they're kind of going, okay. But they'll listen a lot more. Whereas if you did that at the beginning, or if you come in, this is why I wore the suit, to try and get some kind of a little bit of bias-inflected thought here. But if you come in with your frickin' slacker outfit, and you got your pants going down to your knees, and you're just like, dude, what's up? To some 60-year-old conservative, boom, it's just out, And I talk to liberals all the time, and they're like, but I got to be me. I got to be honest to myself, And I think my response is, well, you're being unfair to this other person. You're basically distorting their view of you by throwing something at them that they can't relate to, and it distorts everything from then on. So by all means, be yourself one time, because after that, you're not going to be yourself with that person. He's going to see somebody that isn't you, you know. Yeah, you bet.